really, really cool. I love doing all that stuff.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. And like anybody whose passport I need is in here right now. So please do make sure y'all are continuing to adhere to that and continuing to be safe and smart and all that good stuff. All right, Zoomies, can you hear me? Yes, awesome. Thank you. All right. So instead of really what did we learn last time, although we can talk a little bit about that, what did y'all think about the guest lecture? How so?
I don't know. It's just some of the dynamics of the business and things like that just kind of go over my head.
Okay.
It's really interesting to learn about her perspective and what she does, but it's just kind of like, oh, okay, it's pretty cool.
Okay. Good to know.
Yeah, oh, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, yeah. I would agree with what the last person said. I'm an engineering major, so really over the past 3-4 years, what I've been focused on is really just the engineering side of things. So it was pretty interesting to get a perspective from a professional who's you know, not only on I guess she's not really on the opposite side, but she has her hands in multiple areas of getting a product made. So I thought her sharing that perspective in her day-to-day was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was also cool that she talked. So I knew her back in undergrad, back when she was an architecture major. And so it was cool to see kind of that transition from the first hand of seeing her actually go through it, but then also actually seeing how varied and unique kind of the backgrounds are for all the different folks. Good, I'm glad you liked it, Paxton. Any other comments or concerns? We're going to have a few others, and so if there's stuff that y'all would like more of or less of, let me know now so we can make sure that we are curtailing future lectures to that.
Yeah, I think from my psychology background, I thought it was really beautiful to see that she made a point that it really didn't matter what you were interested in, that there was lots of value in different things, and the importance of understanding a lot of components for it, and then also that her background included a lot of actually like in-person experience and things like that. So I enjoyed learning about her story and following her, and I didn't really know about Open Table, so that was interesting that it had never really come across until now too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cool platform. I only got to be familiar with it because my parents used it back when we lived in DC all the time. And in fact, my parents still used it, and I told them that what they were interfacing with was something that somebody they knew was designing, which I thought was cool. Dennis said, you want to be a product manager? Yes, or a project manager, excuse me. Whoops. Yes, yeah, it seems like a really cool job. I mean, it seems like a unique opportunity to really do a lot of this application stuff. A lot of the tech companies, especially out in like Silicon Valley, tend to do a good job of integrating this sort of human factor stuff, UX stuff. Not to say that other companies don't, but it tends to be somewhat of an afterthought for a lot of you know, these big companies whose primary focus isn't necessarily on the user, it's on product development, right? And so, you know, you think about some of these big defense contracting companies, they essentially get paid after they win the contract, regardless, essentially, of how good the system is, right? There may have to be future work on it. And, you know, poor products can negatively impact their ability to get future products, stuff like that. But, you know, in companies like Open Table, who are actively competing every day for more consumers, it's a much different experience than you would get at some of these other companies for whom, you know, kind of this UX or human factors is a tag on or afterthought. Dennis says, I have a sales background, so I need to sell those guys on the arsenal on this and create my own job. There you go. Perfect, Dennis. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you go into human factors, you're going to be working on sales a lot. I mean, in the sense of having to sell, not necessarily for your job, but why you're doing what you're doing. And you heard Demi even talk about this last time of, you know, sometimes the CEOs, the C-suite folks aren't going to care about what you're going to propose to do. And you have to make some sort of case to them of, look, this is going to save us money, or this is going to bring in additional revenue, or this is going to be time savings, or it's going to enhance the experience for the user, etc. And so even companies like these tech companies who are really interested in the user experience are still going to be competing against time commitments, right? Time crunches. I won't name the company, but I had another friend that went out and worked for a tech startup out in the Bay Area that was trying to essentially do what Apple Pay does, but before Apple got Apple Pay. And they kept running into a whole bunch of roadblocks, right? And they raised stupid amounts of money from people you would know, household names, but they still struggled to get the product out in time. And then they were beaten to market by Apple Pay, and they went completely belly up, right? And so there is still this kind of competition of, yes, let's consider the user, but we need to get the product out and we need to be able to use it ASAP, or at least be first to market, etc. Any other comments, questions, or concerns, thoughts? Sure said, I think it was awesome. She shared the documents she created to keep everyone organized. Is her email listed anywhere? I would like to be able to communicate with her again. I don't know if I wrote it down. Yeah, so it's at the end of her presentation. And I went ahead and uploaded her talk to Canvas. She asked that we restrict the dissemination of that, and so not go on YouTube for people to find all over the place, but y'all can still have access to it for this class. So I don't know if Canvas gives you the option to download. If so, don't download it, just watch it on Canvas. And at the very end of her presentation is her email. But if you can't find it, let me know and I can get it for you. But yeah, she was very open about saying she'd be willing to talk to y'all about it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Well, if you have any other comments, questions, concerns, things you don't like, things you want to see done differently next time, let me know. I tend to like this idea of bringing in people out in the real world into the class to at least talk about what we're talking about, because I think it helps kind of reaffirm a lot of what we're talking about in class. That being said, if y'all don't like it or you don't think it's a value add proposition necessarily in this class, let me know and we can restructure it for later in the semester. The current plan is for the next guest speaker to come in and talk. She does user experience with Facebook's AI systems. And so I think that could be a potentially interesting talk. But again, let me know if y'all don't find it useful or beneficial. All right, here's your fun fact of the day. The first item sold on eBay was a broken laser pointer. I thought it was apropos, given our conversation with Demi about her little TikTok startup of trading up from a hair clip to a house.
Yeah, that was the funny thing is I didn't realize who she was until she said that, and I was like, oh yeah, I know who this is now.
Oh, do you? Yeah. Yeah, so I've known her forever, and it's weird to see her face on like the Washington Post and things like that are doing all these write-ups. I guess just Demi. Oh, think about it. But yes, there you go. Now you know a pseudo celebrity. All right. So today's lecture is not in your book, but I felt like it should be, and the fact that I thought it should be led me to actually just kind of interject this in, and it fits. It would normally flow directly from the vision lecture, but I think this is a critically important concept to get for anybody doing UX or human factors stuff. In fact, when you listen to a lot of kind of the industry leaders in UI and UX stuff, they say that the most important things you can have going into a job is an understanding of affordances and Gestalt grouping principles. And I'll show you some examples of those at play later on. But these are so critically important and so used on all sorts of design systems, including websites, et cetera, that you don't really necessarily notice when they're not there, or excuse me, when they're there, but you notice when they're not there. You'll notice when things don't seem right, and we'll go over some of those examples. So if you have an interest in going out into the world of UX, UI, human factors, really spending time and devoting effort to understanding the principles of affordances, understanding Gestalt grouping principles, etc., will help. So for those of y'all who have taken my sensation and perception class, we have talked about affordances before, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with them, affordances are a set of actions that describe the possible interactions between a user and an object. So affordances include the obvious actions you can perform with an object, like a coffee cup affords holding coffee. But they also include actions which may not be all that evident and obvious. So it affords throwing, right, in anger. It affords hammering things down. It affords holding pencils on people's desks, etc. Right, and so when we talk about affordances, what we mean is just kind of this catch-all term for possible actions associated with an object. And really, I think the term affordances is the single greatest indication that if you have an ego as big as mine, you should go into academia, because you can essentially just make up words and make people start using them, right? If you're good enough at what you do, you can just create terms like affordances, and all of a sudden, it kind of is worked into the nomenclature of society, of science, etc. And so this is J.J. Gibson. He is kind of what's thought of as the pioneer of kind of this conceptualization of affordances. And there's a whole philosophy within perceptual psychology all about perceiving affordances. Can I jump from here to that desk, right? When you think about folks who do parkour or that free running, right? It's a non-stop judgment of affordances. Can I grab onto that ledge, right? Can I jump over this, etc. I often also think about affordances in terms of like MacGyver. If y'all have seen the movie with MacGyver, you know that he will use things that are comically not designed for his task at hand to actually do what he needs to do, right? Defusing a bomb with a paperclip and duct tape, right? They afford that, but you have to actually go out and seek those affordances. And so Gibson argued that affordances aren't created, and nor do they have to be perceived to be there, but they're just inherent to the object itself. Right? I mean, you could think about all sorts of creative affordances with keys. You know, I used my key earlier today as a knife to open my packet, or my Lean Cuisine package. And he says we may or may not perceive it, but it's always there. Right? And so this is going to be kind of important when we start talking about the actual tapping in and training of affordances in a little bit. And so a reasonable question is, okay, well, what about running into a sliding glass door, right? Sliding glass door does not afford walking through. And so running into it kind of creates this conflict between perception, its perceived affordances, and the actual affordances. And so Gibson would just say that this is a misperception. You perceive the door to be open, but it turns out that perception was wrong. One of the most important things you can take away from the concept of affordances is that it's entirely dependent on this idea that vision's sole purpose is to guide action in your environment. Right? We use vision in a lot of other ways, at least we think about it in other ways. You know, using it to appreciate beauty. But there are entire schools of thought within psychology that says anything that evolved within the visual system did so to make us more acutely aware of possible actions. So, one example we're all familiar with is the distinction between the handle and the bar. Right? Our initial perception of the affordance for each one of these is perhaps that the bar affords pushing, right? When you look at the doors leading out of here, you could, in theory, grab on to the very narrow ridge or edge of that push bar and try to pull it. But the affordance of pulling is less than that affordance of pushing of that object, right? The handle typically is used to afford pulling, right? So when you look at doors, if you've got a handle, it's usually to indicate that you pull. And this is where you start getting into trouble when it's actually a push and it's got the handle, because people will try pulling the door and it won't open, right? And so you have this discrepancy between the perceived affordance and the desired action with that object. So again, when we talk about things like these push plates on doors, they serve no purpose, no structural, no functional purpose other than to guide action, right? It's just trying to direct you to A, what's the action you should perform, push, and where should you push on this side of the door, right? So who can give me another example of an object that has a typical affordance? Give me a typical one, and then kind of an atypical affordance.
I don't know if this is exactly a great example, but trying to be a little bit different than a door. But sometimes I think about like the lines on the roads and stuff, because they assume that, you know, you understand what that means.
Yeah. Yeah, so what would be a kind of atypical affordance of those lines?
Not really sure.
Maybe like a sobriety test or something on the side of the road?
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, you have these kind of typical affordances. So the typical affordance of the iPad is everything we would think about an iPad being for. An atypical affordance would be me throwing it to Andrew in a game of, you know, let's check Andrew's hands and how deep his bank account goes if he doesn't catch it. So yeah, when we think about these things, again, the visual information is attempting to guide our actions. You also can get into this idea of kind of creating affordances as technology gets better, right? There are a certain set of affordances every touchscreen seems to afford us, right? Kind of regardless of platform, a single tap gives you a different response than a quick double tap. Dragging something, so grabbing on it and just dragging it across the screen, usually does something different than just a quick swipe. You can pinch or spread, right? And things like pinching and spreading, the swiping, the dragging, those are all reliant on these kind of typical affordances with things, right? When we want to make things bigger, kind of expand it, right? When we want to make things smaller, we contract it. When we want to move on to something else, in a book, for example, we just swipe, right? It's a lot more of a mechanical action, but it's still a swipe nonetheless. And then thinking about the affordances of pressing, right? And so what's something in the digital sphere that y'all interact with that informs you it affords pressing or clicking? Yeah.
There's like a button.
Yeah, a button, right? And so we'll go over that in just a second. But the shape and design of buttons online don't really need to be that way, right? I mean, you could register the same responses with just flat text that says click here. But the actual appearance of the button, we have learned, affords clicking and pressing, right? So it's directing behavior to certain directions. You can also think about hyperlinks, right? Are there any experiences more frustrating than having a dead hyperlink that you click on and it just continues to not open a page, right? It affords that clicking behavior, or it appears to afford that clicking behavior, but nothing actually happens. And so again, when we look at kind of that visually directed or guided actions, you can see something on the left-hand side that if it just says submit with no sort of indication when you hover over it, or no real shading or anything like that, it doesn't really give you the immediate perception that you can do something with that button, right? And that's how websites will actually indicate to you that you haven't completed something. So if you go on a form and you have to fill out a certain number of fields, some of which are required, if you haven't filled out the required ones, they'll typically give you a submit button like you have here on the left, right? That's saying you can't click on it, keep looking. You can then kind of transition to something that is at least a little bit more defined, and this is kind of more reliant on some of the Gestalt grouping principles we'll talk about in just a second. But it at least gives you kind of the appearance that there is something to be done in this general vicinity, right? But when you start incorporating the beveled edges that you get on the buttons in the real world, it starts creating this kind of perceived affordance that you can actually click on the button and make something happen. So can you all think of any examples in the real world where they may be trying to actually screw with your affordances to throw you off? A lot of video games? How so?
Like, still having to do the password and when you search items or stuff, it doesn't make it really obvious that those things are what you need. So you have to like walk around for like 20 minutes trying to figure out what to do because it's like I don't even know what I'm supposed to do.
Exactly, yes. Or having a room filled with other objects in video games that you can pick up or look like you should be able to pick it up, but can't actually do anything there. Yeah, that's awesome. One of the things I think about are escape rooms. If you've ever done an escape room, all they're doing is playing with your affordances, right? There are certain things that objects should not be able to do, or you should not be able to do with objects that you usually can in these escape rooms. Has anybody in here on Zoom done one before?
I've done one of these papers.
Have you?
Yeah.
Can you remember anything specifically in there?
They had a lot of loose game items, so like chess pieces and decks of playing cards and stuff, and we were all like spending time looking through all of those things, but then it would be like something under the actual board or whatever that we were supposed to look at. We
Yes.
ended up making it through one of the rooms, but then there was like a whole second one that we didn't get to.
Yeah. Yeah, I did one years and years ago. and they had something hiding in the toilet. Like not in the actual bowl of the toilet, but like in the support structure for the toilet, right? And so you're again playing with the sort of affordance of, okay, toilets don't really afford hiding things in those certain areas, but that's what they were playing with. Dennis says online ads or confirmation screens where they switch the red, green, or the yellow colors. Yes. Yeah, and so they can play around with you a lot on things like that. They'll also frequently try to rely on this sort of instinctual nature. So I went and was going to reserve a U-Haul for my motorcycle the other day. And after you click on the thing you want, it takes you to a series of like 8 different screens of, you know, movers and equipment and stuff like that. And right, you know, front and center on each new screen is next. And the next, the default is, yes, I want everything you just upsold me on. And so, yeah, they're again trying to just kind of mess with your ability to click and to notice these things. And frequently, you'll notice at the bottom of emails, mass distribution emails, the unsubscribe link is frequently not hyperlinked. Well, it is hyperlinked, but it doesn't appear to be hyperlinked, right? They're trying to make it as unobvious to you as possible that you can actually click on that unsubscribe here. All right. And so this is kind of a theoretical debate, less so than a practitioner's debate. But, you know, are they created versus are they always there for you to pick up on? However, the conversation then kind of morphs into, are they innate, right? Are they things we can always know, or do we have to learn these things? Right? And you think about these child safety devices, like what you have here, what they're doing is actually screwing with the child's affordances, innate affordances, right? Because you see this button right there in the middle. For those of you all on Zoom, just that button right in the middle of the actual safety lock. That button doesn't do anything, right? And so what they're doing is getting a kid to click that button in that natural exploration that isn't going to actually do anything that would get that lock undone. All right, so if you're in here, go ahead and talk with a partner. If you are at home, just go ahead and think about this for a second, and then we'll bring it all back together. Think of things you interact with every day that have certain affordances. Do you think you learned those affordance perceptions, or were they innate? Can you think back to a product that very effectively used affordances? What about a product that was very ineffective using affordances? Or what caused you to misperceive affordances? Talk with a neighbor or think about it for a few minutes, and then we'll bring it back together.
Oh, yeah, I just looked back when I was from Apple and Microsoft. Yeah. You just tap it and stuff and just one that I thought of was already missing with your affordances. It's like when you have a pencil and don't push from up here, just push from the side. And like when I was younger, I wanted to do that. I had to write it.
I was just thinking about those documents that sometimes send to your email, and like they'll have like a button, or they'll have like a little space that you can only put text into, but if you click on the box, it sends you to a different one. Like the little dials on the stove that you can like twist. You don't like press it in, pull them or anything.
There have been certain things in cars. I noticed the difference between like my sister's really beautiful car versus my mom's really one, and like the way that things interact. Each one thinking it's going to be something that's not being thought of.
Yeah, I had running a blank on misperceived affordances.
You know, I feel like my brain is this All right. Yeah, that's a good that's the center.
16 more seconds.
Oh, here we go. The one within that can be answered with your hands and fake hands pockets. Stupid. Then you put your hand in the pocket, it's not there.
Like,
So dumb.
like what's even the point?
I don't know, ask anybody who designs anything that's coming, why they do this.
All right. What have y'all come up with?
I thought about like a safety pin or a bobby pin. Like bobby pins are used for your hair. I use them like almost every day, but you can also use them like in the typical household locks inside. If you like get locked out of a room or like want to see where your parents hide the Christmas presents, you know, you can just put it through the door and unlock it. Or like safety pins. I know like you can use them for diapers or holding your clothes or a rip or anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think those are great examples. In fact, I think when I think of that sort of bobby pin or safety pin, I don't actually think of anything fashion related. I think of it usually as, can I open the door to my bedroom or any of those lock things? Exactly. Good. What else?
I have
Yeah,
an example of one that is used badly. There's this pen in my house that it's got the stylus on one end and then it's a pen on the other. I still haven't figured out how to get the pen part to come out because it doesn't connect. There's no there's the little tip. It looks like it should twist, but I
Yeah.
sat there and for a couple minutes and couldn't get it open before I just gave up and found a different pen.
Yeah, there needs to be an obvious affordance, especially for these new objects as you're learning it. If they're not coming with specific instructions, you got to figure out, okay, what is the best way to convey to the user? This is how you use a pen. Even if the technology is old, if it's masquerading as something else, that makes it a complete nightmare. Yeah, that's awesome.
That, and I raised the example of the pens that click using the clip instead of any other kind of button.
Yes, yes.
I hate those
So
much.
using pins that click with just the actual, yeah, like the shirt clip, but not the actual button on top. What else?
Affordance, but it just seems like a lot of office phones are way too involved with like, all of these features, all of these buttons, and it's like, I really just need to use it as a normal telephone.
Yeah, or the ones that have programmable buttons on the side that don't actually do anything unless you program them to do that, right? So they afford clicking and then it doesn't actually do anything. Yeah, that's great. One of the examples I think of, in my truck, I've got a series of knobs and buttons that look very similar in the sense that they've all got kind of ribbed outside edges and look like also something you could press. And some of them you can press, some of them you can't press, some of them you can turn, others you can't turn. And so, yeah, this is where you start getting into, you need to convey in some manner what the actual desired action is with these actual systems. Let's see, Dennis says, light switch seems pretty intuitive, maybe learned behavior, but it is obvious how to use even a three-way light switch where the switch might be pointing in the opposite direction. We still switch it and get the light on. Yeah, exactly. And so we'll talk about that a little bit with configurable displays, right? And so we have kind of this mental model that when you flip a light switch up, the light should go on. When you flip it down, it should go off. And when you've got those three-way ones, wherein you've got a couple light switches at different points of the house, you sometimes get the case where you go to switch on the light and it turns off another light or vice versa, right? So having that kind of incompatibility, that poor configurable display. Different types of blinds. Some don't have strings to lift, some have button press, then normal string kind, yes, absolutely. And so if we weren't in COVID times, I'd bring you down to my office. We have all these weird new windows, and I don't think there's any out in the hall here. But to get the blinds to rotate, you have to like, there's a little tab on the corner that you have to like lift up like an inch or so to get them to rotate. There's no way that I've seen of being able to actually pull up the blinds. And then you can separate an inner core from the outer window, but to do so, you have to, it looks like pull tabs, but instead of pull tabs, you're supposed to slide them, and that unlocks it. And so after COVID, y'all can come by my office and I'll show you just a poor design. But yeah, you're exactly right. Those types of blinds. Perfect. Exactly. Yeah. So sometimes people add complexity because they like the design, they like the look, but you have to think about, okay, what affordances are you conveying with having something that has a little lip on it that looks like I should be able to pull it out? I'm not the smartest man, but I like to think I can figure out window blinds. And it took me a few minutes to figure out how to even adjust my windows in my room, in my office rather. All right, questions about affordances before we move on to Gestalt grouping principles. Cool, all pretty straightforward. All right, so Gestalt grouping principles just describe the way in which we see the environment, right? How are we grouping things together? So y'all tell me, give me examples of things that you use to group in your everyday life, whether it's people, whether it's objects, etc. Size, color, shape, exactly. Yes, and we will go over that. A couple of those are going to be very similar to the actual Gestalt grouping principles. What else?
I guess, you know, when you're making breakfast or another meal, you kind of group your vegetables or whatever on one side of the plate, your meats and whatever on another side of the plate, and like your grains, your bread, your rice on one side of the plate.
Yeah, so you're grouping by kind of similarity, right? So you can have mixed vegetables that all go together. You're not separating out the peas and the corn and carrots or whatnot. Yeah, so you're grouping by similarity. Good. Anybody else think of something else?
I organize my closet like according to sleeve length instead of color.
Sleeve length instead of color. That's good. Yeah, I've never organized my closet by anything other than work clothes and everything else. But the sleeve length may be good. It may save time. I like that. That's very good. What were you saying, Caitlin?
The difficulty level, different tasks on your to-do list.
Okay, yeah, different difficulty levels, right? So if one is your thesis and another one is responding to an email, if you get a secondary task that comes in that says, you know, hey, I need you to design an entire experiment, that's probably going to be grouped with your thesis rather than your responding to email. Proximity, group of toothpicks, exactly, yeah, so proximity, perfect. Or a crowd at a sporting event is seen as one crowd, yes. Yeah, so y'all are intuiting a lot of these Gestalt grouping principles. Here are just some of them. So first, proximity, right? And so objects which are closer together in proximity tend, there we go, to be grouped together, right? And so we see that as one column of objects, another column of objects. We tend to group them, in this case, in the columns rather than in the rows, right? Because the closer they are together, the more we kind of just see them as one thing. So in Dennis's example, the crowd or the toothpicks, exactly. Similarity is us grouping things together that have some sort of conceptual similarity. So whether it's grouping the vegetables together and the meats together on our dinner plate, or if it's looking at you know, grouping the tables together in here and the chairs together. Things that are similar, we tend to group together.
I have kind of a quick question or like maybe just some commentary on this. So does this encompass like cultural differences in that? Like, is this just kind of giving a broad example of how people categorize and not like necessarily like why or anything? Well, I mean, it is
Yes.
broad.
Yeah, so this is definitely broad, but you can think about, so let's take the example of reading, right? So in the US, we read from left to right, and a lot of other cultures, they'll read right to left, right? So I think, first one comes to mind, I think is Arabic. They read right to left, right? And so when you group letters together, they're going to make a lot more sense to us for the groups if they're organized in a meaningful structure from left to right than right to left. Whereas those who speak and read Arabic are likely going to have a lot more difficulty with that left to right configuration and a lot easier time with that right to left than we do who may only speak English or read English. But yeah, you're right. There are various cultural differences, and there's a whole line of study talking about cultural differences in these types of grouping and associations. So what we're talking about here is mostly kind of visual environment grouping, but there are also other kind of conceptual groupings of in-group versus out-group, et cetera, that tend to be more kind of dependent on those cultural differences. But good question.
Okay. That's like, so these are like the types of grouping, like you're saying, but then they can have different meanings and have different applications depending on who's actually doing it. Okay.
Yeah, potentially. Now, these are what I'm talking about here are fairly universal across cultures and across ages, but there can be kind of different cultural explanations or differences for, yeah. So.
Awesome.
Good question. All right. So we also have continuity. So we tend to perceive this cross over here on the right-hand side as a vertical line and a horizontal line, right? We tend not to perceive it as 4 different smaller lines coming together. We tend to perceive it as just continuation. That's a good continuation, and that's a good continuation. We also tend to create perceptions of things that aren't there to help with our grouping, right? And so most people see this on the left-hand side as a white triangle overlaying a series of black circles rather than a series of black Pac-Men all facing the center, right? And so at first glance, you tend to see these phantom edges, right? You tend to see a continuation where there's a gap, even though there's not an actual continuation there, all right? And so we have this kind of closure, this predilection towards closure that suggests that this circle is likely, in fact, a circle and not something with a wedge cut out. Area, so we tend to group this background as a single object and this smaller square as a subset of that object. And then we also tend to rely on symmetry, right? And so we tend to see this on the right-hand side as 2 diamonds overlapping one another, rather than a shape that would look something like that and another shape that would look something like that. All right, we tend to think things are just kind of symmetrical. All right, so when you think about all of these groupings, think about what kind of evolutionary advantage each of these would give. All right, so similarity, when you're looking for the berries in the bush, it makes sense to group all the berries together, right? So you've got this conceptual understanding of there are berries located within that actual bush there. Another example of proximity, on the left-hand side, we tend to see this as 3 groups of 2 lines apiece rather than one group of 6 lines apiece. The similarity can also be with these shapes and not just colors. The continuity, we tend to see this single line running all the way through and having a squiggly line over top of it. And then connectedness, we can group these things together. We can kind of force people to see them as grouped together by just providing some sort of contact between the two of them, right? By just drawing a connection between them. We also tend to group things together by what's known as common fate, right? And so you can see in this animation here, we tend to group all of the circles as one object that are moving down together, and another object for the circles that are moving up, right? And this allows us to see kind of intentionality. So there's some really cool research that looks at essentially taking dots and just putting a whole bunch of dots in a screen and having almost all of them move randomly. And then you'll have one kind of triangle that's moving around. And the research looked at how good are you at picking up a single dot that may be chasing this triangle in the background. And we're really good at picking that up because of this kind of grouping, because of this common fate actions. So I turn right, so too does this other object. I'm going to now monitor that for a perceptual grouping. We also have figure ground assignments, right? And so what you see here is entirely dependent on your grouping of what is the figure, which is to say what is in front, and the ground, which is to say what is behind. So if you've ascribed this black object in the middle as the figure, you see it as a vase, right? If you ascribe that to be the ground and the white surrounding to be the figure, you tend to see it as 2 faces right on top of each other. So now let's apply this to a real-world example. Go ahead and take 2 minutes and try to identify as many Gestalt grouping principles in this old Gmail layout as possible, and then we will talk about them all together. "23 more seconds. All right. What did y'all see?
You have similarity with how the unread versus the read messages are.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and so you are relying on this kind of perceptual grouping of the white being, I think, the unread messages and the grayed being the read messages, right? It makes it conceptually really easy to say, okay, I want to see what unread messages I have, or I know I got an email from Jeff Wellington and I haven't read it yet, so let me go and look for that based off of my understanding that all of the unread messages are kind of housed in that white highlight. Great, what else?
On the left side, under chat, you have I think it's Adele, Jason, Meredith, Michael, and Paul. That all the insignia right next to them signifies, or they're grouped closer together because they're online to chat or available to chat. Whereas, Peter and Kathy, they're in their own separate groups of either being, I guess, sleeping or don't disturb. And then AJ
Yes.
and the one below that is not available.
Exactly, yeah. And so you're again grouping based off of the color of what looks like little cameras next to it, right? And so you know that these people are all available. You know that these people are probably folks you could get a hold of if you needed to, but are not available. And you know that AJ and I can't read the last name down there, are completely unavailable, right? So again, you're grouping by color off of there. You're also grouping by proximity, right? I mean, so you can see that there's kind of a continuation of color from the unread messages into the chat area, but you've got the proximity, which is telling you that this is its own conceptual group, and then every line here is its own conceptual group. Hannah says, similarity in email categorization colors, i.e. to do, family, etc. Yeah, and so you again see the colors here that allow you to conceptually group all of these together, right? And so it helps when you're seeing it, but it also helps for kind of the application in the real world. If I know, I want to look at, okay, what are my to-do list things? I've got this both perceptual, but also conceptual grouping. I know what I'm looking for. It makes it a lot easier to narrow down that search when I know exactly what I am looking for. What else?
The check mark by comfortable. Basically, it's, which one of these is not like the other. So
yeah,
you can understand that one is selected, and we have a visual cue of the check mark, but you can also understand that those other two would be selectable by the proximity.
Exactly. Yeah, that's great. So not only are you relying on the proximity of that check mark to comfortable to say that those are of a single group, but you're also differentiating comfortable from cozy and compact to say, okay, this is selected and cozy and compact are not. So cozy and compact are their own group. Our own conceptual mental model of them is that, well, I haven't selected them, but because they are in the group, the larger group, with something I have selected, I can probably rely on trying to select those as well. Yeah, that's great. Give me one other one. Yeah.
Oh, I thought that they did a similar thing with the inbox, how it's close in proximity to start, set down drafts, but then it's red, so it attracts your attention.
Yeah, exactly. So you grouped all them together to know that this is probably the area where I'm going to go to navigate everything, but you've created a differentiation for whatever you've selected, right? And so it's saying these are of the same conceptual group, but now I'm creating smaller subgroups to allow you to know what is the difference between these. Yeah, that's fantastic. So, great. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you could do the same for like the email threads where it's like me, Phil, Meredith, 5, Peter, me too. Like that's like connectedness.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. So it's relying on understanding that this is almost kind of an ordered presentation of what was the message chain there, but also, who is involved in that message chain. Exactly. Exactly. All right. You all need to brace yourselves because I'm about to show you a series of things you will never be able to unsee after I show them to you. Gestalt grouping principles will ruin your life. You probably have all seen this, right? We all see the World Wildlife Federation logo as being a panda, even though there's no real connection up here, right? That these are kind of just floating out there, but we group it all together and we see a panda. The FedEx logo has an arrow hidden away in the actual logo itself, right? Are inherently reliant on that sort of Gestalt grouping there to say, okay, look at this good continuation of that arrow rather than just the E and the X. The Pittsburgh Zoo and PPG Aquarium, right? You've got random birds flying around out there, but when you take the totality of it, you get the gorilla and the lion, or the jaguar. And then other companies think they're being extra sneaky by just distorting what you see here with the U and the A and hiding that S in there. But we all have that percept of that S. Even though it's non-existent, it still forces that sort of percept. All right. So really quickly, we're going to do one more activity. All right. So if y'all are not familiar with the Wayback Machine, you should become familiar with the Wayback Machine. What it does is pull from different sources that have used web crawlers to go get websites at different stages. And here is one of the first, if not the first, UAH websites that exists amongst these web crawlers. This goes back to May 13th, 1997. Was anybody in this class born after 97? Yeah. Oh my God, I'm so old. Yes, okay. So this website is older than all of y'all, but I'm old enough to remember when websites did look like this, right? And so if you have your own computer that you want to go on this to and play around, just go to, let me see. I don't want to type it in case it's the wrong URL here, but I think it's just waybackmachine.com. Come on. Wayback Machine. Yes. Nope. So it's archive.org, it looks like. Yeah, archive.org, and you can type in the UAH website there. My God, you all are so young. Make me feel bad in the chats. And if you go and click on 1997, click on May 13th, indexed at 11:07 p.m., and this will pull up, and you can, this was the initial page, and so you can go to the standard or tables view, and it takes you to this. So play around with this and try to identify some of the poor affordances, some of the good affordances back then, and try to identify what is really different about the website between now and back then as you go around to it. That isn't just, it has nicer colors and fonts associated with it. So identify some of the Gestalt grouping principles and some of the affordances, and then we will talk about what y'all discover. For those of y'all in here that don't have a computer, if you want me to click on any links, let me know.
There's just so much going on this page alone.
I know. See what the admissions page was.
Like it looks like different when you go to a different page. Like it doesn't really even look like the same website.
Yeah, yeah, there's not good continuation there.
It's so empty. Why do they leave it?
What's that?
6,400 per academic year.
Oh, with the tuition?
Oh my God. Yeah, okay.
One of the things I immediately notice is there's no back button here, or redirect menu. You have to actually go back. Go back.
There's no like search that you just like go to any page.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not easy on the eyes at all. It's very harsh.
Yeah. So these are all principles we're going to be talking about throughout the semester of design, making it easy.
Like this screen just explains it to you. Very aggressive.
All right. So what are some of the good and bad grouping and affordance principles that we've talked about?
So the categories like about UAH colleges research, like everything under them is relevant and fits well with its big heading.
Yeah, yes, they've done a good job of kind of the grouping here within the proximity, but also you have kind of these borders around it. This drives me nuts that they have about UAH and they've got two hyperlinks and they've got something that says faculty senate and there's just nothing hyperlinked there, right? And so, you know, it's in some way conveying that you should be able to select on it or there should be some source of information, but there's nothing there. What else?
Everything looks kind of the same. So, you know, you're looking at it and I would think that probably if you were, say, the head of UAH, you might want to highlight maybe admissions to get new, you know, new students, or maybe you want to highlight the about UAH. And of course, you have the grouping top to bottom, but nothing feels really highlighted. It all has the exact same weight. There's nothing that really jumps out at you other than the picture at the very top.
Exactly, yeah. So there's not really grouping by conceptual things, right? So things like admissions and student life are probably going to matter a lot more to prospective students and their parents than is things like research and the colleges, right? So research is probably going to matter to graduate students, but not necessarily in the same way that admissions and student life. Public service, I don't know who that's going to matter to, right? It's probably going to be to the community members who want to know what in the world is UAH doing for the local community, right? And so that, yeah, additional kind of larger scale grouping, so they're not just all over here. One of the things that bothers me, though, about this is, in this case, the hyperlinks are blue, and if you go to another page, the hyperlinks are green, right? And so my first thought was, okay, do these do something else, right? Are these going to give me some other information? This looks like it may just take me to Circle K's website. No, UAH's Circle K Club which is an entirely different, so these hyperlinks are all maroon, and yeah.
That background looks like one of those magic eye pictures, so when you unfocus your eyes, you see something.
Yes, it does. It does.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay, cool. If you go back to the home page.
Yeah, let me get there. Okay.
Apologies if somebody already pointed this out, but it really bothers me that right under the UAH picture, it just repeats the names of all the big headers below. And then below that, there's actually a menu of new things that are almost completely lost and that are nowhere else on the page.
That's a very good point. I hadn't noticed that. Yeah, this is entirely a regurgitation of what's down here, right? And the perceptual grouping of this as its own group makes you think that this must be something different than one of the other groups, right? That this is not just a reiteration of what you have down here. So that's a really good point. Dennis, to answer your question, I don't think so, because that was an external link, and you get things like, you know, Alabama's Manufacturers Mall, which is an outside link, but blue. I don't know. Maybe. There's got to be some rhyme or reason, I would imagine, but.
It looks like each club got to design their own page because like they all have different backgrounds and things like that. So it may just be the organization decided that was their department's color.
Yeah, could be.
You have the continuity of your brand of UAH like we have now.
Yes. Yeah, it's a very good point.
The other thing to remember too, I don't know if I'm the oldest in the class, but I'm definitely old. But the fact that these pages would have taken probably a good 20, maybe 30 seconds up to a minute to load. So you would just watch from the top down as each column of information would kind of start showing up on your screen. So
you're exactly right, Dennis. Yeah, the younger of y'all have not had to deal with this, where it literally renders one line at a time, and you can watch the web page or the pictures come into frame just one at a time, going through all of it. Yeah, that's a very good point. This also bothers me. I suspect it's not meant to be so, but you have groupings here where up here is all smaller text than down here, right? So this to me conveys that, okay, this maybe is a header or something different. Nope, it looks like they just forgot to make it all the same font size. Moving down here. And now this one does have a return to UAH homepage. That's good. Sorry, what did you say, Paxton?
One of the things I noticed was missing that you expect to see on any college's website is a link to the campus map. I didn't see that at all.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, and so you have kind of these conceptual ideas of what you should be looking for. And if you are looking for a campus map, there are some of these things that almost look like maps at first glance that may throw you off for that. Can I click on that? What does that do?
Did Google Maps even exist in '97?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah, so it would have been like Alta Vista or GeoCities or something. Somebody would, that technology might not have been.
Yeah, or even just having some sort of, you know, static, almost like PDF map would probably have been the standard back then. But what else do we notice? Is there any difference between the standard and table versions of the homepage? It looks like the only difference is pictures. Pictures, it also looks like now they have grouped up these, you know, news, index, jobs, and help. And they've got now what is regurgitated down here off to the side, and it looks like I can click it. Yes, see, now that's one of the problems you can see. As I hover my mouse over, there's no differentiation between any of these, right? And so you've got a perceptual group that they're all together. And if I'm not getting any grouping associated with kind of the hard borders for each of these buttons to click, to me, this seems like if I just click this, this should take me to a single page. But in reality, where I click matters, because now that's just going to take me to the research page. Yeah, let's go back to there.
This is more of a design thing, but I guess you could say that our brain, like, it seems like the UAH on the side and the table view, it's not faded enough to differentiate between the menu above it or the menu items. So it almost, and this might be my screen, you know, but it looks like kind of that whole, the UAH is not really clearly defined in front of the image, and then the UAH on the side is also, it needs to be lighter than the dark text, you know, that it all kind of bleeds together, makes it hard to read.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So we're essentially ascribing figure to anything of color here and ground to that white backdrop, which now makes it really kind of hard to read, but also conceptually difficult to see, okay, is this, you know, just a colored, you know, logo in the back, or, you know, behind buttons, or is it supposed to be a single unified thing, which again is being conveyed to us by this border here, but also that grouping of UAH there. That once again seems to signify that this is a single clickable button rather than distinct individual buttons in there. But you can also see my confusion about whether I click this. I only get that signifier with this 21st century, you know, Mickey Mouse glove on my computer. There's no signifier that I can click this if I just have that arrow, which was the standard for all the way back in the 90s. And so again, that's not conveying enough information that I can also click these, right? And so there's not the affordance necessarily that these are clickable in the same way that you would want that to be conveyed. Perfect. All right, so go home and play around, have fun with the Wayback Machine. You can see some wonderfully awful late 90s and mid 90s designs. And just look around for different things in your everyday life that have these different kind of Gestalt grouping principles, different affordances, and figure out how you're kind of being manipulated on a daily basis by these things that are just kind of, you just treat as normal directions of how to act that are getting you to act in a specific way over others. So without further ado, that is it for today. And this time I will see you next week. And yeah, I'll stick around if y'all have any questions. Otherwise, have a good weekend.